Hey guys, tonight we are going gently, unhurriedly, and with remarkable administrative thoroughness all the way back to ancient Egypt, to a world of warm sandstone walls, the slow green curl of the Nile, papyrus rustling in a dry afternoon breeze, and one of the most quietly charming institutions in all of human history, the Lost and Found Office. Not the dramatic Egypt of golden burial masks and towering pharaohs, not the Egypt of armies and obelisks and grand theological arguments carved into temple walls, though all of that is nearby, just around the corner, just down the road, always looming gently in the background the way it does. Tonight we are going somewhere smaller, somewhere cooler and dimmer, where a scribe sits cross-legged on a reed mat, carefully inking the details of a missing sandal onto a piece of papyrus, and the ceiling is low and the oil lamp flickers, and outside the world is very large and very hot. But in here, things are manageable, things are organized, things are, against all odds, filed correctly. You probably wouldn't survive ancient Egypt, by the way, not because of the pharaohs or the crocodiles or the political intrigues, though those are all real concerns, but because the average Egyptian drank beer for breakfast, worked in temperatures your body would find deeply unreasonable, and considered a lunch break to be a spiritual right rather than a scheduling suggestion. You would admire the architecture, develop an immediate sunburn, lose one of your sandals, and find yourself, within the first 3 days, standing in front of a small administrative office, trying to explain your situation to a very patient scribe who has heard it all before. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I would absolutely love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your location and your local time in the comments, whether you're tucked into bed in Melbourne at 2 in the morning, or sitting in a reading chair in Edinburgh with a cup of tea, or lying on a couch in Sao Paulo listening through earphones while the city hums outside your window. I find it genuinely wonderful to think about all the different places this quiet little story reaches. It makes the whole thing feel a bit like sending letters, which, as it turns out, is something the ancient Egyptians also did, and occasionally also lost. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with the air. The air in ancient Egypt, specifically in the Nile Delta region during the middle of the day, is something your lungs would need a few weeks to negotiate with. It is dry in a way that feels almost personal, like the atmosphere has made a specific decision about moisture and is committed to it. There is fine dust that seems to exist in a permanent suspension just above ankle height, caught in every shaft of light that angles through a doorway or a high window opening. The smell is complex: baked earth, river water, the faint sweetness of acacia wood, something cooking somewhere, oil burning slowly in a clay lamp, linen that has been washed in the Nile and dried in the sun so many times it has achieved a kind of purity that modern fabric softener would not know how to replicate. The heat sits on everything like a very large, very quiet animal that has decided to rest here and sees no reason to move. It is somewhere around 1200 BCE, give or take a century in either direction, which is a perfectly acceptable margin of error when you are dealing with ancient Egypt. The settlement you are in is not one of the famous ones. It is not Thebes or Memphis or Heliopolis, gleaming with significance. It is one of the hundreds of workaday towns that lined the Nile like knots on a rope, towns built around grain storage and craft workshops, and the steady, unremarkable business of people living their lives at a functional distance from all the grandeur. The streets are narrow and mostly unpaved, which is to say they are packed earth made smooth by 10,000 years of feet, and the buildings are mud brick, which is to say they are the color of the landscape, warm brown and ochre and pale gold, so that at a certain hour in the afternoon the whole town seems to dissolve slightly into the ground it stands on, as if everything is gently returning to where it started. There are children running somewhere. There are always children running somewhere in ancient Egypt. Archaeologists have found toys, spinning tops, wooden animals on wheels, small carved figures with articulated limbs, and the evidence suggests that Egyptian children treated the space between buildings as a continuous obstacle course, which they navigated with a confidence and volume that the adults around them had long since decided not to comment on. Dogs trot through the streets with the particular self-possessed energy of dogs who know they are in a good place to be a dog. Somewhere, a donkey is expressing a mild grievance. You get used to it. The building you are interested in tonight is easy to miss. It does not announce itself. There is no great carved lintel above the door, no painted columns, no indication that anything of official importance happens here. It is a modest structure, 2, possibly 3 rooms, with walls thick enough to keep the inside cool, even when the outside is actively trying to cook things. The doorway is low, which means you duck slightly as you enter, which means you are already in a posture of mild humility before you have said a single word, which may or may not be entirely intentional on the part of whoever designed it. There is a rush mat just inside the entrance. There is a low table along one wall. There is the smell of ink, which is a smell you would recognize, faintly acrid and earthy at the same time, and the smell of papyrus, which is its own thing entirely, green and slightly marshy beneath the dryness, like a memory of the river it came from. And there, seated on his mat, is the scribe. His name, for our purposes tonight, could have been Amenhotep, or Ka, or Nebwenenef, or any one of dozens of names that appear again and again in the administrative documents that have survived from this period. Let's call him Ka. Ka has been a scribe for 22 years. He began his training as a boy of 5 or 6, sitting in the scribal school, the House of Life, learning first to hold the reed brush correctly, then to copy signs, then to understand the grammar of a language that had already been in continuous use for 2,000 years before he was born, which is the kind of fact that would stop most people in their tracks, but which Ka processes as simple professional context. He is good at his job. He is patient, which is the primary requirement of his job. He can write in both hieroglyphics and hieratic, the more cursive, everyday script that Egyptians used for practical documents, the administrative handwriting of a civilization that had things to get done and did not always have time to carve them into stone. His handwriting is neat and consistent and has been described by his supervisor in an evaluation that still exists on a surviving fragment of papyrus that historians have since translated with no small amount of delight as adequate and without significant complaint, which in ancient Egyptian administrative parlance is roughly equivalent to a glowing reference. He is, this afternoon, recording a goat, not a live goat. The goat in question is a lost goat, and Ka is entering it into the register, the document that tracks all items, animals, and objects that have been brought to or reported at this office, with the same meticulous care he brings to everything else. The entry will include a description of the goat, the name of the person who reported it missing, the date of the report according to the Egyptian civil calendar, and any distinguishing features that might help identify the animal should it turn up. The goat has, apparently, a particular marking on its left ear, and a disposition that its owner describes as contrary, which Ka records without editorial comment because that is what a professional does, though the slight set of his expression suggests he is filing this adjective away for private contemplation later. This is the thing about ancient Egypt that tends to surprise people when they first encounter the evidence, the sheer, almost obsessive thoroughness with which Egyptians wrote things down. We tend to picture ancient civilizations as existing in a kind of oral fog, knowledge passing from mouth to mouth, records kept loosely, if at all. But Egypt was emphatically, enthusiastically literate, at the administrative level, at least. The bureaucracy generated documents in enormous quantities: tax records, census data, court proceedings, letters of complaint, letters of praise, contracts for the sale of property, contracts for the rental of property, records of grain distributions and bread allocations, and the daily rations given to workers at large construction projects. The workers at Deir el Medina, the village of craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, left behind such an extensive written record of their daily lives that historians can tell you not just what they ate and how much they were paid, but what they argued about, who was late to work, and on at least one occasion, what one of them dreamed the night before. The ancient Egyptians were the people who invented the paper trail, and they were very committed to it. The lost and found office, in whatever form it took across different towns and administrative districts, was a natural extension of this impulse. You do not build a civilization on documentation and then fail to document your losses. That would be philosophically inconsistent, and the Egyptians were many things, but philosophically inconsistent was not one of them. The system, as best as scholars can reconstruct it, and historians still argue whether this was a formally centralized institution or a more informal function absorbed into existing administrative structures, worked something like this. Items found in public spaces, on roads, near the river, in the market, or anywhere else that wasn't clearly someone's private property would be brought to the local scribal office. Similarly, people who had lost something of value, and value here means anything from livestock to jewelry to tools to, on one memorable documented occasion, a wig, could report it. The scribe would record both. If a match could be made, the item was returned. If not, found items were held for a period, and then, depending on the nature of the object and the local administrative customs, were either redistributed, handed to the temple, or simply remained in the system, waiting the way lost things do. The market is where most of the action comes from tonight, so let's go there for a moment, because the Egyptian market is a very good place to be, provided you don't have anywhere urgently to be, which tonight you don't. The market is not a building. It is a wide open space, a plaza, a stretch of road, a flattened area near the river landing where boats come and go, and it operates in the morning when the heat is merely ambitious rather than fully committed. There are people everywhere, moving in the particular fashion of people who are shopping, slightly distracted, occasionally purposeful, frequently diverted by something they weren't expecting to find. The vendors are arranged in loose clusters, more or less by category, in the way that markets everywhere tend to self-organize, because humans have a deep instinct for putting similar things near each other and always have. There are people selling bread, which comes in round flat loaves and also in more elaborate shapes, cones, long rolls, small figures of animals, and people for offering purposes. There are people selling fish, which is extremely popular and which is dried or salted for preservation in ways that the heat, ironically, assists with. There are people selling vegetables, leeks, onions, garlic, lettuce, which the Egyptians considered mildly sacred in a way that lettuce has not been regarded since. There are people selling pottery, copper tools, linen, reed baskets, wooden combs, patience beads and colors ranging from pale turquoise to deep cobalt blue. The exchange system in ancient Egypt during this period is, by modern standards, slightly baffling, and you would find yourself standing in the market, turning your pockets out in the way of a person who has just discovered that the local economy does not work the way they assumed. Egypt did not use coinage until very late. Coins arrived around the 7th or 6th century BCE, practically yesterday by Egyptian standards. Before that, everything operated on a barter and weight-based system, using a unit of value called the daben, a weight measure, roughly 90 grams, usually of copper or silver, as a way of pricing things, without actually exchanging the metal every time. So a transaction might go, this jar of honey is worth 5 daben, this linen cloth is worth 8 daben, I will take the cloth and give you the honey and owe you the difference, to be settled in grain or fish or another commodity at a later date. It all worked largely on trust and memory, which is perhaps why the Egyptians also invented receipts. This system, beautiful in its flexibility and terrifying in its opportunities for miscalculation, also meant that the market was full of negotiation, not aggressive negotiation, not the kind with raised voices and theatrical gestures, but the patient, practiced, almost musical back and forth of people who have been doing this their whole lives. There are hand gestures involved. There's a particular tilt of the chin that means I am considering your offer, but I find it insufficient. There is a small pause before a counter offer that functions as a kind of reset, a breath that says we are still friendly here. We are simply in the middle of a process. And in the middle of all this, things get lost. Of course they do. This is a market. This is a crowd. This is an economy operating on memory and mutual agreement in temperatures that make concentrated thinking somewhat aspirational. A child puts down a toy to look at something, and when they turn back, the toy is gone. A woman sets her basket down to free both hands for a transaction, and when she picks it up, it is lighter than it was, and upon investigation is missing one small copper amulet that she has carried for 17 years. A farmer secures his donkey to a post and returns to find the donkey has expressed its opinion of the post by departing entirely, taking with it the rope, the pack, and a minor portion of his afternoon plans. An artisan, distracted by a vendor selling something he wasn't expecting, steps out of his sandal in the press of the crowd and does not notice until he has walked another 30 feet, and by the time he goes back, the sandal is simply gone, absorbed into the general commerce of the day. These are the people who end up in the early afternoon when the market has quieted and the heat has reached its fullest expression and the town has folded itself into the semi-slumber of the midday rest at the door of Ka's office. The midday rest, by the way, is something ancient Egypt takes very seriously. Historians still argue whether the institution was formally built into work schedules or simply observed as a universal cultural understanding, but the evidence suggests that the hottest hours of the day, roughly from midday until mid-afternoon, were considered the rightful property of stillness. People went inside. They lay down on sleeping mats. They closed their eyes and let the thick cool of the mud brick walls do its patient work. Even the animals reduced their activity to a kind of philosophical minimum. The dogs found shade and arranged themselves in the positions that dogs adopt when they have decided that effort is not currently on the agenda. The Nile itself seemed slow, its surface going glassy and unhurried in the white light of noon. Ka does not rest at midday. This is a personal choice and something of a point of professional pride. While the town sleeps, Ka catches up on his register, cross-references recent entries, and occasionally allows himself the small luxury of rereading reports from earlier in the year, the way other people might reread letters from friends. He has a system for organizing his papyri that is entirely his own invention, and which his assistant, a young scribe in training named Senifer, who is 17 and deeply earnest, and asks questions at a rate that occasionally makes Ka feel slightly tired, cannot fully replicate, and does not entirely understand, which Ka considers appropriate. Institutional knowledge, in his opinion, should require at least a little institutional experience to access. Let's spend some time with the register, because the register is genuinely one of the more charming things that exists in the archaeological record of ancient Egypt, and because the contents of lost and found records from any culture, any era, are a kind of accidental poetry about what it means to be human and to own things and to occasionally be separated from them. The Egyptian administrative documents that survive give us tantalizing glimpses of exactly this kind of inventory. There are records of missing grain allocations, disputes over livestock, reports of objects found on roads and riverbanks. One document, from the workers' village at Deir el Medina, records a dispute over a stolen chisel with a level of procedural detail that suggests the chisel's owner had some feelings about the matter. Another records the disappearance and subsequent recovery of a copper tool with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of a scribe who has successfully closed an entry in the register and found closure in the completion of the form. The Egyptians understood the psychological relief of a finished document. They would have made excellent accountants. They would have been deeply satisfied by spreadsheets. So, the register. It is a long roll of papyrus, stored loosely rolled and weighted at one end by a small clay weight that has left a faint oval impression on every document it has ever touched. Ka unrolls it to the current working section and reviews. This week's entries include one goat, contrary, left ear marking, owner user hat, day 4 of the current month. 1 copper bracelet, plain, no inscription, found near the river landing, no claimer to date. 1 bundle of linen, 3 folded cloths of medium weight, owner unknown, found in the market, possibly left during the recent festival. 1 child's toy, a small wooden horse on a wheeled base, which Senifer, when first shown it, made an involuntary sound of delight. Before recovering his professional composure, 2 sandals, not matching, different sizes, possibly therefore representing 2 separate incidents of sandal loss rather than one unfortunate bilateral event, and 1 wig. The wig deserves a moment. Wigs in ancient Egypt are not a vanity item in the way the modern mind might classify them. They are a practical, culturally significant, and widely worn accessory across class and gender lines. The climate makes them sensible. A wig over a shaved head is cooler than natural hair in the heat, easier to maintain, and can be removed and stored and brought out for important occasions. Elite wigs are elaborate, made of real human hair collected and prepared by specialist craftspeople, oiled and braided and shaped into the heavy symmetrical styles you see in tomb paintings. Everyday wigs are simpler, plant fiber, human hair, sometimes a combination, but they are still valuable, still personal, still the kind of object that represents a significant investment and whose absence would be noticed and felt. The wig in Ka's register was found in the marketplace on the morning of the last festival day. It is described in Ka's careful hand as black, medium length, style of the current fashion, somewhere at the left side, smelling of the oil of moringa. The person who found it brought it directly to the office rather than leaving it where it lay, which Ka noted in the register with a single word that translates roughly as correctly. The wig has been with Ka for 11 days. No one has come to claim it. This bothers him, mildly but persistently, the way a small loose thread in a piece of fabric bothers a person with an eye for order. Somewhere in this town, there is a person who attended the festival, lost their wig in the market, went home presumably wearing less than they'd planned, and has not yet made it to the office to report the loss. Ka has a theory. It is not a theory he has shared with Senifer, but it is a theory he returns to occasionally in the way you return to a good puzzle. His theory is that the wig's owner is embarrassed. The loss of a wig is, in its specific way, a slightly absurd loss. It is not like losing a sandal, which is a dignified kind of loss, a mechanical failure between foot and ground, comprehensible and forgivable. The loss of a wig implies a particular kind of moment, a moment of confusion, perhaps, or excessive motion, or an encounter with a crowd more forceful than expected, and the owner may have decided that the wig, while valuable, is not worth the mild social cost of coming to the scribal office and explaining that they no longer know where their hair is. Ka has some sympathy with this. He is a man who understands the specific calculus of minor embarrassment versus bureaucratic necessity. He is also a man who has the wig, and who will continue to have the wig until someone comes for it, because that is what the register requires, and the register is, above all, the thing Ka trusts. The afternoon begins to cool, almost imperceptibly at first, a slight softening of the light, a breath from somewhere west of the desert that carries just a little less heat than the last one. The town begins to wake from its midday pause. You hear the first sounds, a door, footsteps, a voice calling something domestic across a courtyard, the renewed interest of the dogs in what might be happening at ground level. The market will not reopen today. It had its morning, it is finished. But the workshops and the rooftop social gatherings and the waterfront activity all resume with the gentle consensus of a community that has been through this before and knows the rhythm. Ka puts down his brush and allows himself a moment of stillness. This is not meditation in any formal sense. The Egyptians had a complex and elaborate spiritual life, a relationship with the divine that was woven into the texture of every day, in the household shrines, in the small amulets worn against the skin, in the prayers offered at the beginning and end of work, in the deep and sincere belief that the gods were not abstract beings, but active presences with preferences and responses and the capacity to be both helpful and annoyed. Ka's stillness is something smaller than all of that. It is simply the stillness of a person who does one kind of work all day and finds that occasionally doing nothing for a few minutes makes the next hour possible. Through the low doorway, the light outside is turning gold. This is the best light in Egypt, this late afternoon hour when the sun stops trying to dominate everything and starts instead to cooperate with the landscape, when the mud brick walls turn amber and the Nile in the distance becomes the color of hammered copper, and the palm trees stand very straight and simple against a sky that is deepening slowly through shades of blue towards something darker and enormously clear. Egypt at dusk is one of the more beautiful things the planet does, and people have been noticing this and mentioning it and trying to find adequate words for it for approximately 5,000 years with mixed success. Senefer arrives at the door carrying 2 small cups of beer and wearing the expression of someone who is about to ask a question. He has been doing this for 7 months, and Ka has developed an ability to read the specific texture of Senefer's arrivals the way you might read weather. Today, the question is about the classification of found objects, specifically how to distinguish between an object found and an object abandoned, and whether the distinction matters for record-keeping purposes. This is actually a very good question, and Ka pauses before answering, which Senefer knows by now means the answer will be worth waiting for. The distinction, Ka explains, accepting his cup of beer, is one of intention. An object found is an object whose owner did not mean to part with it. An object abandoned is one whose owner, for whatever reason, made a decision. The register does not concern itself with abandoned objects. The register concerns itself with the gap between what a person has and what a person was meant to have, and the administrative process of closing that gap. Senefer thinks about this for a moment, and then nods in the way of someone who was looking for a practical answer and received a philosophical one, but has decided it will do. The beer is worth mentioning, because Egyptian beer is one of those historical subjects that begins as a curiosity and expands, the more you look at it, into something genuinely fascinating. Egyptian beer, called henket, was not the crisp, carbonated, refrigerated affair you might be reaching for right now if you're in a certain kind of mood. It was thick, it was nutritious, it was made from partially baked bread, fermented in large clay pots, and strained before serving into a liquid that was somewhere between a drink and a meal, with a low alcohol content by modern standards, and a flavor that surviving accounts suggest was tangy, slightly sour, and probably an acquired taste. though in ancient Egypt the acquisition had begun at breakfast, so by evening most people were thoroughly accustomed to it. Workers at large state projects received daily beer rations as part of their compensation, documented with the same meticulous care as their grain allocations. The Egyptians understood that a workforce without adequate hydration is a workforce with declining enthusiasm, and beer counted toward hydration in a climate where water from the Nile required careful handling. This is the kind of historical fact that makes ancient Egyptian civilization feel suddenly warmly human, not despite the beer, but because of it, because here are people solving the same problems of keeping everyone functional in difficult conditions that every civilization has to solve, and arriving at solutions that include a daily allocated beverage. Ka and Senifer drink their beer in the last of the afternoon light, and the office is quiet, and the register is rolled and weighted, and the wig is in its storage corner, and the wooden horse waits patiently on its wheels. And outside, the town is doing the gentle evening things that towns have always done, people moving toward food and fire and conversation, the smell of cooking drifting over the mud brick walls, somewhere the sound of a sistrum, a metal rattle used in religious music, shaking in a pattern that suggests a household ritual, an evening offering, someone at their small shrine saying their quiet words to whatever deity they have found most responsive. Historians still argue whether the kind of record keeping we're describing tonight was conducted in dedicated physical locations, or whether it was one function among many in the general scribal office. The truth is probably that it varied by settlement, by era, by the personality and administrative habits of the senior scribe in charge. What we know is that the records existed. What we can reasonably infer is that there were people whose job it was to keep them. What we can say with confidence is that the instinct behind the system, the conviction that a lost thing deserves to be looked for, that a gap in someone's inventory is worth noting, that the work of reuniting people with what they've lost is real work, is an instinct as old as ownership itself and has not gone anywhere since. There is something very comforting about this, actually, if you let yourself feel it. The idea that in a town in the Nile Delta 3,000 years ago, a careful man sat with his reed brush and his papyrus and wrote down that someone's goat was contrary, and someone's bracelet was plain, and someone's wig smelled of moringa oil, and that all of these facts were worth recording. All of these small domestic losses were worth the ink and the effort, because somewhere there was a person who needed them back, and the system existed to help that happen. The bureaucracy, which we so often experience as an obstacle, as a wall between us and what we want, here appears in its original form, which was not an obstacle but a promise that the state, or the community, or the institution, whatever you want to call the thing larger than one person, was paying attention. There was a legal dimension to this, of course, because the Egyptians were also an emphatically legal civilization, fond of contracts and testimony and the formal resolution of disputes through documented process. The concept of ma'at, cosmic order, balance, justice, truth, all of these things at once in a single word that resists easy translation, was the philosophical backbone of Egyptian society, and it applied to lost property as naturally as it applied to anything else. A world in proper order was a world where people had what they were supposed to have. An object sitting unclaimed in a storage room while its owner walked around missing it was a small but real disruption of that order. The lost and found office, in this sense, was a Ma'at maintenance operation. Every successful reunification of person and property was a tiny restoration of cosmic balance, filed and noted in the register, because even cosmic balance deserves proper documentation. The evening deepens. The stars in Egypt are extraordinary, a fact that needs stating even now, because the Mediterranean sky, before significant light pollution, was something that people wrote about in terms that sound like exaggeration until you understand they were just trying to be accurate. The stars were known and named and used for navigation and calendrical calculation with a precision that required generations of careful observation and careful record keeping, because of course it did. Egyptian astronomers, who were also priests, because the domains of knowledge were not divided the way we divide them now, had cataloged star positions and tracked their rising and setting with an attention that produced, among other things, a civil calendar of 365 days, which is still essentially the calendar you are using tonight, to keep track of when you need to wake up in the morning. Ka has closed the office. There is a specific way he does this that has not changed in 22 years. He rolls the register. He checks the found items in their storage area, each in its appropriate position. He trims the lamp wick. He straightens the low table in a way that serves no functional purpose, but that satisfies something in him that requires straightness in the things he is responsible for. He steps through the low doorway into the evening, ducking the lintel the way he has 10,000 times, and stands for a moment in the cooling air. Somewhere out in the residential lanes, a dog barks twice and then stops, having apparently resolved whatever question it was investigating. The sound of the sistrum has quieted. The cooking smells have shifted from the sharp heat of active fire to the lower, warmer, residual fragrance of a meal recently finished. A cat. Egyptian cats, who have been domestic and opinionated in Egypt since at least the Middle Kingdom, and who are fully aware of their semi-sacred status, thank you, and decline to pretend otherwise, crosses the road in front of Ka with the particular feline confidence of a creature that has assessed its situation and found it satisfactory. Ka walks home. The streets are narrow enough that he could almost touch both sides, and in the places where the buildings lean slightly toward each other, the sky above is just a strip of deep blue, pricked with early stars. His house is 5 minutes from the office, which has always seemed to him the correct distance, close enough to return if he needs to, far enough that the walk constitutes a genuine transition between work and everything else. His wife, whose name in the documents of this town might have been Nefertari or Meritaten or Tay, has left him food under a linen cloth on the low table in the main room, because he is reliably late in ways that have been, over the course of a long marriage, elevated from an irritation to a household institution. He sits, he eats. He does not think about the register mostly. He does think briefly about the wig, still there, still unclaimed, the moringa oil faint now after 11 days. And he decides, as he has decided each of the last several evenings, that tomorrow might be the day someone comes for it. He is not anxious about this. He is simply keeping it in the right mental compartment, the way a professional keeps things that are technically still open. The case remains active. The register is honest. Tomorrow the office will open again, and the morning will come with its donkeys and its dust and its particular heat, and someone will duck through the low doorway, and the process will continue, because the process always continues, because that is what processes are for. And now here, the day begins to breathe out. Let the image soften just a little. Let the sharpness of the mud brick and the dry air and the bright market light begin to diffuse, the way things do when the mind is moving toward rest rather than toward waking. The Nile is dark and quiet tonight, its surface carrying only the reflection of stars in long, wavering lines, the way water always has, the way it will continue to do long after every document in Ka's register has turned to dust and been replaced by the desert. The desert, which is always just at the edge of everything in Egypt, patient and unhurried in the way that only very large and very old things can be. The town is quiet now. The mud brick holds the warmth of the day inside itself, releasing it slowly through the night in a long, slow exhalation, so that lying against a wall in the dark, you can feel the stored heat of the sun, the warmth of all those hours filtered through stone and earth and offered back to you gently, without any of the urgency of noon. It is a good feeling. It is the feeling of being held by something very much larger and older than yourself, something that does not need you to do anything in return, something that has been doing this, holding heat, releasing it, beginning again, for longer than language has existed to describe it. Ka sleeps. Senifer, somewhere in his own smaller house, sleeps. The found goat, wherever it has been housed for the night, probably with a neighbor's small animal enclosure, a temporary arrangement pending either return or further administrative processing, sleeps in the specific, deeply unconcerned way of goats, which are animals that seem constitutionally disinclined to worry about their circumstances, contrary or otherwise. The wooden horse sits in its corner of the office on its wheeled base, waiting with the absolute patience of objects, which have no experience of waiting at all, and therefore do not find it difficult. Somewhere in the town, the wig's owner is also sleeping, and in the morning, perhaps, they will wake and think about it again. The small, specific absence, the festival day, the press of the crowd, and perhaps this time they will decide that the minor embarrassment is worth it, that the moringa-scented object in the scribal office is worth claiming, that the gap in their life is small but real, and the system exists specifically to close it. And in the morning, Ka will be there. The lamp will be lit. The register will be unrolled to the current working section. The reed brush will be ready. The low doorway will be waiting for whoever needs to duck through it next, with their small domestic losses and their patient hopes, in a town on the edge of the Nile, in a civilization that believed, as deeply as it believed anything, that the world worked best when everything and everyone was restored to where they were supposed to be. That is enough tonight. That is more than enough. Let that thought settle over you now, like the warmth that the mud brick keeps. The idea that somewhere in the long human story, a careful person was keeping track of your lost things, writing them down in good ink on good paper, waiting without impatience for the moment you came back for them. The stars over Egypt are extraordinary tonight. The fan hums softly. You are here and you are warm, And somewhere in the long, quiet record of everything that has ever been, your name is written down correctly. Sleep well,